Hey everyone, thanks for stopping by. If you're the kind of person who likes to put one of these on before bed, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so the next one shows up for you automatically. While you're getting comfortable, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. Once you've done that, dim the lights, pull the blanket up, and let's get into it. The Foghorn. I took the assistant keeper position at the station because the pay was decent, and I wanted a winter alone to finish a manuscript I'd been putting off for 3 years. The lighthouse sits on a spit of rock off the northern coast, connected to the mainland by a causeway that floods twice a day with the tide. I'm 31, I don't scare easily, and I'd spent 2 seasons on fishing boats before this, so isolation wasn't new to me. What was new was the sound. The station itself is a squat white tower attached to a keeper's cottage that was built in the 1930s and hasn't been meaningfully updated since. The light still runs, automated now, cycling every 8 seconds. The Foghorn, though, was decommissioned back in the 90s when they installed a radio beacon system instead. The horn housing is still bolted to the seaward wall, a rusted brass throat the size of a washing machine, but the compressor that used to feed it was stripped out years ago. I know this because the Harbour Authority told me directly when I signed my contract. There is no working mechanism. It cannot make noise. I want to be clear about that before I tell you what happened. My first 2 weeks were quiet in the way I expected. Wind against the windows, gulls in the morning, the tide working the rocks below the cottage like something breathing. I fell into a rhythm. I wrote in the mornings, checked the automated systems at noon, walked the perimeter before dark. I called my sister most evenings on the satellite phone because cell service doesn't reach that far out. She's the practical one in the family, an ER nurse who has heard every excuse a person can give for being somewhere they shouldn't be, and she has zero patience for anything she can't measure. The first time I heard it, I was asleep. It was somewhere around 2 in the morning, and the sound came through the walls like something enormous clearing its throat. A low, dragging blast, the kind that vibrates in your chest before your ears even register it as a sound. I sat straight up in bed. My heart was going so hard I could feel it in my neck. I told myself it was a passing tanker, some commercial vessel running its own horn out past the point, and the geography of the rocks was just carrying the sound strangely. That explanation held together for about 4 seconds until the blast repeated, exactly the same pitch, exactly the same length, coming from directly outside my window, not from the water. From the horn housing bolted to the wall 6 feet from where I was lying. I got up, pulled on a jacket over my t-shirt, and went out with a flashlight. The night was clear, no fog at all, stars out, the kind of visibility where you can see the mainland lights across the channel. There was no ship anywhere on the water. I walked around to the seaward wall and put my hand flat against the brass throat of the horn. It was cold, just ordinary cold metal, salt-crusted, silent. I stood there for a long time, waiting to see if it would happen again while I was touching it. It didn't. I went back inside and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I called my sister and told her about it, trying to sound more amused than I actually felt. She asked the obvious questions. Did I check if it was hooked up to anything? I told her the compressor had been removed years before I ever got there, that I'd seen the empty housing myself, that there was no possible way for the horn to physically produce sound. She said maybe I dreamed the second blast, that the first one woke me up disoriented and my brain filled in a pattern. I wanted to believe that. I told her she was probably right, and we moved on to other things. For 3 nights after that, nothing happened. I started to relax, chalked the whole thing up to exhaustion and an unfamiliar house settling around me in ways I wasn't used to. Then, on the 4th night, I woke up not to the horn, but to a change in the room. It's hard to explain except to say that the air felt heavier, like being underwater, and there was a smell that hadn't been there before, something like wet rope and rust. I lay still, listening. No wind, no gulls, nothing. Then, from directly outside, low and drawn out, the horn sounded again, once. Then a pause of maybe 10 seconds, then again. I made myself get up. I told myself that if I stopped checking, stopped confirming there was nothing there, the fear would only get worse, so I needed to look every time. I went to the window that faces the seaward wall. There was fog that night, thick, rolling fog that hadn't been forecast, curling up off the water and swallowing the base of the tower. And standing on the rocks below the horn housing, half obscured in the fog, was a shape. Tall, upright, wearing something long that moved slightly, even though there was no wind I could feel through the glass. I couldn't make out a face. I couldn't tell you if it had one. I stood frozen at that window for what felt like minutes, and the horn sounded a third time, and the shape didn't move at all when it did, like it wasn't the source of the sound, just standing near it. I did not go outside that night. I locked the cottage door, which I had never bothered to do before, and I sat in the kitchen with every light on until the sun came up. When it was light, I forced myself to go check the rocks. There was nothing there. No footprints in the wet stone, though stone doesn't really hold prints anyway. No sign that anyone or anything had stood where I'd seen the shape. I checked the horn housing again. Still cold, still empty, still disconnected. I photographed the inside of it with my phone, the torn-out wiring, the missing compressor. Proof to myself more than anyone else that there was no mechanism. I called the harbour authority that day and asked as casually as I could manage whether there had ever been any incidents at the station, any accidents, anything involving a previous keeper. The man on the phone was older, had worked for the authority for decades, and he went quiet for a second before answering. He said the station had a keeper back in the 60s who went missing during a bad fog, presumed to have gone out onto the rocks to check the horn manually during a storm and been swept off. They never found him. He said it like it was a piece of trivia, not a warning, and then he asked if everything was all right with the equipment. I told him everything was fine. I want to say I left after that, but the truth is more complicated. The contract paid well, and leaving early meant paying back a relocation stipend I didn't have. So I stayed and I adjusted. I started sleeping with earplugs, which did nothing because the horn isn't really a sound I hear with my ears, so much as feel in my sternum. I set up my phone to record every night, propped against the window facing the seaward wall, hoping to catch something concrete. For the first several nights of recording, nothing happened at all. No horn, no fog, no shape. I started to think maybe the act of recording had scared it off, which is a strange thing to believe about a phone camera. But by then I wasn't thinking clearly about much. Then, on a night I hadn't been recording because the phone had died and I forgot to charge it, it came back worse than before. The horn sounded 4 times instead of 1 or 2. Between the third and fourth blast, I heard something else, a scraping sound against the outer wall of the cottage itself. Not the horn housing, but the stone wall of the building I was standing inside. Like fingers or claws, or something being dragged slowly along the mortar seams. I stood in the hallway with my back against the far wall, as far from the seaward side as the small cottage allowed, and I did not move until the light started to change outside the window at the end of the hall. When I finally went out that morning, exhausted, hands shaking, I found something new, a long, thin gouge in the stone wall of the cottage at roughly chest height, running maybe 3 feet horizontally, fresh. The stone dust from it was still pale and unweathered, not yet darkened by salt air the way everything else out there gets within days. I ran my finger along it. It was smooth in a way that didn't match a tool mark, more like something had been drawn along the surface with even deliberate pressure. I called my sister again, and this time I didn't try to sound amused. I told her everything: the horn, the shape in the fog, the missing keeper from the 60s, the gouge in the wall. She listened without interrupting, which for her is unusual, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She didn't tell me I was imagining it. She asked if I wanted her to drive up, which would have taken her most of a day given how remote the station is. I told her I'd think about it. I haven't called her back yet to give her an answer. It's been 6 days since the gouge appeared. The horn has sounded 3 more times since then, always between 1 and 3 in the morning, always preceded by that same wet rope smell and the sense of heavier air. I haven't seen the shape again, but I've stopped looking out that window when it happens. I keep the recording running every night now, and every morning I check the footage, and every morning the audio is there, clear as anything, the horn sounding exactly on schedule, but the video shows nothing on the rocks at all, just fog or clear night, and an empty stretch of stone where I know, because I felt it happen, that something was standing. 3 nights ago, I tried something different. I'd read once that fog signals were historically used to guide people home, not warn them away, and some stubborn part of me wanted to test whether the horn was hostile or just present. I stood at the window instead of hiding in the hallway, and when the first blast came, I didn't flinch away from it. The fog rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen it, swallowing the tower light entirely, and the shape appeared again on the rocks, closer to the cottage than before, close enough that I could see it didn't have the proportions of a person standing normally. Its shoulders sat too high, its head tilted at an angle no neck should allow. And when the second blast sounded, I swear the shape's outline shuddered in time with it, like the sound was moving through it rather than past it. I stopped taking notes that night. I just watched, frozen, until the fog thinned enough for the shape to be gone, and I don't remember deciding to look away, only that at some point I was sitting on the kitchen floor, with my back against the cabinets, and no memory of walking there. In the morning I found salt water, not seawater exactly, but something with the same brackish smell, pooled just inside the front door, as though something had stood there dripping before I ever woke up. There was no rain that night. The causeway hadn't flooded high enough to reach the cottage. I don't have an explanation for where the water came from, only that it dried by midday and left a faint white residue on the floorboards that hasn't fully scrubbed away. I mentioned the salt water to the harbour authority man on our next scheduled call, framing it as a plumbing concern rather than what it actually was, and he told me the cottage's pipes were all inspected before I moved in and shouldn't be leaking anything, let alone anything with a brackish smell, since the water supply out there is drawn from an inland well rather than anything connected to the sea. That ruled out the one mundane explanation I'd been clinging to. I didn't push the conversation further, mostly because I didn't know what I would even ask next that wouldn't make me sound like I needed to be relieved of the post entirely, and some proud, stubborn part of me still didn't want that. My contract runs through the end of winter. I have 11 weeks left. I don't know if I'm going to make it that long, but I also don't know how to explain to the harbour authority why I need to leave a job I signed up for, specifically because I wanted the isolation. Every night now I lie in bed and wait, listening past the wind and the gulls and the ordinary sounds of an old building for that first low blast to start. And I think about a keeper who went out onto those same rocks 60 years ago and never came back. And I wonder if the horn is warning something away or calling something in, and I honestly don't know which possibility scares me more. The doll in Unit 4B, I signed the lease on the apartment because it was the only one bedroom in the neighborhood I could afford. That wasn't a total wreck. The building is from the 50s, brick exterior, radiators that clank in the winter, the kind of place where you can tell generations of people have lived and moved on. My unit is 4B, top floor, corner unit with decent light. The previous tenant, according to the leasing office, had lived there for almost 20 years before moving into assisted living. They told me the unit had been professionally cleaned and that anything left behind had been donated or thrown out. That wasn't entirely true. I found the doll on my 3rd day, while I was going through the hall closet trying to figure out shelving. It was pushed into the back corner behind a loose panel of drywall that had come away from the frame, like someone had deliberately hidden it there rather than just forgotten it. It's a porcelain doll, maybe 16 inches tall, wearing a faded blue dress with lace trim that's mostly disintegrated. Its face is cracked along one cheek, a thin hairline fracture that catches the light strangely. I'm not someone who's ever been bothered by dolls the way some people are, so I didn't think much of it. I figured I'd donate it or toss it, but I got busy unpacking and it ended up sitting on a shelf in the closet, forgotten, propped against a stack of towels. I want to say clearly that I never moved that doll after I set it on that shelf. I didn't touch it again for almost 2 weeks, which is why it unsettled me so much the first time I opened the closet and found it sitting on the floor instead, facing outward, positioned like it had been placed there on purpose rather than fallen. I remember standing in front of the closet holding a laundry basket, just looking at it, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe I'd bumped the shelf, moving the towels out from under it. Maybe it had been sitting less securely than I remembered, and gravity had done the rest. I put it back on the shelf, this time pushed further back, and closed the door. 3 days later, it was on the floor again, in the same spot, facing the same direction. This time I was more careful. I photographed exactly where I placed it on the shelf before closing the closet door, angle and everything, so I'd have something to compare against. When I opened the door 2 days after that, the doll was on the floor again. And comparing my photo to the new position, it hadn't just fallen forward, it had somehow ended up rotated, facing the opposite way from how gravity would have tipped it off the shelf. I felt something cold move through my chest looking at that. I put it back a third time, and that night I didn't sleep well. I called my mother, who is about as unflappable a person as exists, and told her about it in a joking tone, trying to make it sound like a funny quirk of the apartment rather than something that was actually bothering me. She laughed and said the shelf was probably uneven, or the building settled and vibrated things loose. Old buildings do that. She told me to just get rid of the doll if it bothered me, which was reasonable advice that I somehow couldn't bring myself to follow. I told myself I'd donate it that weekend. The weekend came and went, and the doll stayed in the closet. About 2.5 weeks after I first found it, I started hearing something at night. A faint sound from the direction of the hall closet, a soft dragging or shifting, like fabric moving against wood. It would happen around 1 or 2 in the morning, always brief, 10 or 15 seconds at most, and then silence. The first time I heard it, I lay in bed for almost 20 minutes, convincing myself it was the radiator pipes, which do make odd sounds as they heat and cool. But radiator sounds are metallic, hollow. This was softer, more organic. I finally got up and checked the closet. The doll was exactly where I'd left it, but the closet door, which I always keep shut, was open about 4 inches. I started keeping the closet door taped shut with painter's tape across the seam, a cheap trick, but I figured if the tape was broken in the morning, at least I'd know something physical had happened, rather than my imagination running away with me at 2 a.m. The first night I did this, the tape was intact in the morning. The second night, also intact. I started to relax, thinking maybe whatever I'd been hearing was just the building. Then on the 4th night, I woke up to the sound again. That same soft dragging, except longer this time, maybe 30 seconds, and when I got up to check, the tape across the closet door was peeled cleanly away and stuck to the door frame, not torn, not stretched, just carefully removed and reattached slightly off from where it had been. I stood in my hallway at 2 in the morning staring at that tape for a long time. My hands were cold. My mouth had gone dry in that specific way it does when your body understands something before your mind catches up. I opened the closet. The doll was on the floor again, facing out, and this time its head was turned at an angle it hadn't been in before, tilted like it was looking up at something above it rather than straight ahead. I didn't touch it that night. I closed the door and went and sat on my couch with every light in the apartment on until it got light outside. The next day I did some digging into the building's history, mostly out of a need to have some kind of explanation, even a bad one. I found a local news archive online that had a short article from decades earlier about a resident of the building, an elderly woman who had died alone in her unit and wasn't found for almost 2 weeks. The article didn't give the unit number, just the building address, but the timeline lined up roughly with when my unit's previous long-term tenant would have moved in, which made me wonder if it had happened in 4B itself before that tenant's time, or whether I was just building a story out of coincidence because I wanted one. I mentioned all of this to a co-worker, someone I trust and who isn't prone to dismissing things outright. She suggested I just get the doll out of the apartment entirely rather than trying to manage it in place. That weekend I bagged it up, drove it to a donation center across town, and watched an employee take the bag and set it on a sorting shelf inside. I felt an enormous, almost embarrassing wave of relief driving home. That relief lasted exactly 1 night. 2 nights later, I woke up at around 1:30 in the morning to that same dragging sound, except now it was coming from inside my bedroom closet, instead of the hall closet, which didn't make any sense because I had never kept the doll anywhere near my bedroom. I lay there paralyzed for a long moment before I made myself get up. I opened my bedroom closet door with my hand shaking on the handle, half expecting to see the doll somehow back inside, but there was nothing there except my clothes, undisturbed. Still, from that night on, the sound kept happening, migrating between the two closets on different nights, sometimes soft, sometimes lasting almost a full minute. I called the donation center a few days later, feeling ridiculous even as I dialed, and asked if by any chance the porcelain doll I'd dropped off was still there, or if someone had already taken it. The woman who answered checked and told me, somewhat confused, that they had no record of it, that the bag I described didn't match anything currently on their intake log, and when I described the exact drop-off time and the employee I'd spoken to, she said that employee didn't work Saturdays and hadn't been in that day at all. About a month after the donation center told me they had no record of the drop-off, I had a friend stay over for a weekend, someone who knew nothing about any of this, and I didn't mention it because I didn't want to sound unstable. On the second night, she woke me up around 3 in the morning, shaking my shoulder, asking in a low voice if I'd heard something moving in the hallway. I hadn't heard anything that time, which almost felt worse, like whatever it was had chosen to reveal itself to her instead of me. She described a soft dragging sound followed by what she thought was a child humming, tuneless, just 2 or 3 notes repeated. She left a day early and didn't fully explain why, just said she had a work thing come up. We haven't talked as much since. That was the first time I understood I might not be the only person who could sense it, and somehow that made the whole situation feel less containable, less like something happening only to me that I could eventually wait out. I started looking harder into the building's history and found a long-time resident on the 3rd floor, an older man who's lived there since before my unit's previous tenant moved in. I asked him carefully if he'd ever heard anything about 4B, and his expression changed in a way that told me before he said a word. He said the woman who lived there decades ago, before the tenant I replaced, had a granddaughter who used to visit and play with a doll in the hallway, and that the granddaughter had died young, an illness he didn't specify, and the grandmother had kept the doll afterward rather than getting rid of it. He didn't know anything more than that, or said he didn't, and he seemed reluctant to keep talking about it once he'd said as much. I still live in 4B. I haven't found the doll again, not physically, not sitting somewhere I can point to and confirm. But the sound continues most weeks, migrating between closets, sometimes stopping for 4 or 5 nights before starting again. I've started sleeping with a small lamp on and my phone recording, propped on my nightstand facing the bedroom closet, and every morning when I check the footage, the audio has the sound clearly captured, that same soft dragging right on schedule, but the video itself shows only a closed closet door that never moves. I don't know where the doll is anymore, and some nights that bothers me more than knowing would. The mirror from the estate sale. I bought the mirror at an estate sale about 4 months ago, the kind of Saturday morning sale where a family is clearing out a deceased relative's house and everything is priced to move. It's a tall standing mirror, oak frame, slightly foxed glass with a faint silvering pattern along the edges that gives it an antique look I liked immediately. The woman running the sale told me it had belonged to her grandfather, that he'd kept it in his bedroom for as long as she could remember, and that the family just wanted it gone along with everything else. I paid $60 for it and had a friend help me load it into my car. I set it up in my bedroom against the wall opposite my bed, which in hindsight might not have been the smartest placement, though at the time it just seemed like the obvious spot with good light. For the first couple of weeks, nothing about it seemed unusual beyond the ordinary strangeness of old glass. The slight warping near the bottom edge, the way it made the room look a little dimmer than it actually was. I'm a pragmatic person by nature. I work in structural engineering, and I don't have much patience for things that can't be measured or explained, which is probably why it took me longer than it should have to admit something was wrong. The first thing I noticed was small. I'd walk past the mirror and catch my reflection moving a half second behind my actual motion, like watching a video with a slight lag. I chalked it up to tiredness, the kind of perceptual glitch your brain produces when you're not fully awake, since most of my encounters with the mirror happened first thing in the morning on the way to the bathroom. It kept happening though, even in the evening when I was fully alert, and eventually I started testing it on purpose, raising my hand quickly and watching the reflection catch up a beat too late. It was subtle enough that I could talk myself out of it every single time, right up until the night I couldn't. About 6 weeks after I bought it, I woke up around 3 in the morning needing water. My bedroom was dark except for the streetlight bleeding through the blinds, enough to make out shapes but not detail. I sat up and, out of habit, glanced toward the mirror across the room. My reflection was sitting up in the same position I was, which is normal, except I hadn't moved yet. And it was a full second ahead of me, already upright before I had even swung my legs off the bed. I froze. I told myself I was still half asleep, that my sense of time was unreliable in that state, and I got up and went to the kitchen and drank my water, and went back to bed without looking at the mirror again that night. The following week, I started noticing condensation on the glass in the mornings. Even though my bedroom doesn't get particularly humid, and I don't have a habit of leaving windows open, it would appear as a faint fog across the lower half of the mirror, the kind that forms on a cold surface in a warm room, except nothing about the room's temperature explained it. One morning, wiping it away with my sleeve out of irritation, I stopped because underneath the general fog there was a shape pressed into it, distinct enough that it couldn't have been random condensation patterns. It looked like a handprint, adult-sized, palm and 4 fingers pressed from the inside of the glass rather than the outside, which doesn't make any physical sense for a solid mirror, but that's what it looked like. I photographed it before wiping it away completely, and I sat with that photo for a long time, trying to find a rational explanation. I asked a friend who does restoration work on old furniture whether antique mirrors could develop condensation patterns from age or degraded silvering, and she said it was possible for the silvering to deteriorate and create cloudy patches, but that those patches don't typically resemble handprints and definitely don't appear and disappear on a schedule tied to time of day rather than humidity. The handprint started showing up almost every morning after that, always in slightly different positions on the glass, sometimes low near the bottom edge, sometimes higher, once at a height that would only make sense if whoever left it was taller than me, which put it well over 6 feet. I started keeping the mirror covered with a sheet at night, more out of a need to do something than any real belief it would help. The first night I did this, I woke up to the sound of fabric sliding across the floor, and when I turned on the light, the sheet was pulled at the base of the mirror, not fallen exactly, but pulled down and off in a single motion, like someone had grabbed a corner and yanked it away. I called my sister, who has always been the one in the family more open to this kind of thing, and told her everything. She didn't dismiss it the way I half expected. She asked me a question I hadn't considered, which was whether I'd looked into who the grandfather in the estate sale story actually was, and what had happened to him. I hadn't, mostly because it felt like an invasive thing to ask a stranger selling off her family's belongings. But I did some searching using the address the sale had been held at, and found an obituary from around 8 months earlier for a man in his 80s who had died in that house. The obituary was ordinary, nothing suspicious, natural causes, survived by children and grandchildren. It didn't tell me anything I hadn't already known, and yet reading it made the handprint feel less like a curiosity and more like a signature. Around the 2-month mark of owning the mirror, things escalated in a way I still have trouble describing clearly. I woke up one night to find the room several degrees colder than it should have been, enough that I could see my breath, which had never happened in that apartment before or since. The mirror was uncovered, the sheet on the floor again, and standing in the reflection, behind where my own reflected image should have been alone, was a second shape. Not clearly a person, more like a density in the dark part of the glass, roughly man-shaped, standing close enough behind my reflection that it would have had to be standing directly behind me in the room if it were real. I spun around. There was nothing behind me. I looked back at the mirror and the shape was still there, unmoved, for maybe 3 full seconds before it simply wasn't. I didn't sleep in that room again that night. I moved to the couch and stayed there until morning. The next day I tried to get rid of the mirror. I posted it online for free, figuring someone would take it off my hands within a day, given that estate sale mirrors like this usually go fast. Nobody responded for almost a week, which was strange in itself, and when someone finally did agree to come pick it up, they cancelled twice before finally not showing up at all and stopped responding to messages. I ended up moving the mirror into a spare room and keeping that door closed, which is where it still is. A few weeks after moving it into the spare room, I made the mistake of going in there during the day to grab a box. Not thinking about the mirror at all, and caught my reflection out of the corner of my eye before I'd meant to look. For a fraction of a second, my reflection was standing in a completely different position than I was, off to the side near the frame's edge rather than centered where I stood. Arms hanging differently, head turned toward me instead of mirroring my own angle. When I turned to look directly at it, everything snapped back to normal, my reflection lining up exactly the way it should. I stood there for a long time afterward, telling myself it was a trick of the low light in that room, though I know the room gets plenty of light during the day. I brought in a contractor a week later under the pretense of getting a quote on converting the spare room into an office, mostly because I wanted a second person's read on the space without explaining why. He didn't say anything about the mirror directly, but at one point, while taking measurements near that wall, he paused, glanced at it, and asked if I'd always kept it covered like that, gesturing at the sheet still draped over the top half. I told him it was easier that way while I decided what to do with it. He said, in an offhand way that didn't feel offhand at all, that older glass like that sometimes holds on to things, an expression he didn't explain further and that I didn't ask him to. He finished his measurements quickly and didn't linger in that room longer than he needed to. The condensation and the handprint still appear most mornings, though I've stopped photographing it because looking at the photos afterward bothers me more than seeing it in person somehow. The shape behind my reflection has appeared 3 more times since that first night, always in the middle of the night, always gone within a few seconds of me noticing it. I've thought about just breaking the mirror outright, smashing the glass and throwing the frame away, but something about that idea makes me more uneasy than leaving it alone, an instinct I can't fully justify with anything rational. For now it sits in that spare room with the door shut, and I try not to think about what's on the other side of that glass when nobody is looking at it, though lately I've started to wonder if it only shows up because someone is looking. Night shift at Ridgeline General. I've worked security at Ridgeline General Hospital for almost 4 years, mostly nights, mostly quiet. The job is what you'd expect. Check badges, walk the halls, keep an eye on the parking structure. Respond if a patient gets agitated and staff need an extra set of hands. The hospital itself is a mix of old and new. A main tower built in the 80s with a newer wing added about 10 years ago, connected by a corridor on the 2nd floor. Most of the building doesn't bother me. The sub-basement does. The sub-basement houses the morgue, the old records archive, and a service elevator that's separate from the main patient elevators. Used mostly by maintenance and occasionally by staff transporting deceased patients down to the morgue for processing before a funeral home pickup. It's original to the 80s building, never upgraded. A slow, heavy elevator with a keyed panel that requires an override to access the sub-basement level at all. Most of my rounds don't require going down there more than once or twice a shift, just enough to confirm the doors are secure and nothing's out of place. The trouble started about 2 months ago on a Tuesday night shift, somewhere around midnight. I was doing my sub-basement check, badge in one hand, flashlight in the other, even though the corridor lights work fine, just habit from years of doing rounds. I pressed the call button for the service elevator on the main floor, and it came up empty, like always. I stepped in, badged the override, selected the sub-basement, and the doors closed. About halfway down, the elevator stopped. Not a smooth deceleration, but a hard jolt, like something had cut the power mid-descent. The overhead light flickered, and I heard, very clearly, 3 slow knocks against the outside of the elevator car, spaced evenly, coming from somewhere in the shaft itself, rather than from either floor. I stood there for a solid 10 seconds, telling myself it was mechanical, cable slap, something to do with the counterweight system that old elevators sometimes produce. The knocking didn't repeat. After about 30 seconds, the elevator lurched back into motion and continued down to the sub-basement like nothing had happened. When the doors opened, the corridor beyond was dark, which was wrong, because that corridor is supposed to stay lit at all times per hospital policy. I radioed facilities and reported it, and a maintenance guy came down about 20 minutes later, flipped the breaker, and the lights came right back on, with no explanation for why they'd gone out in the first place. I didn't think much more about it until about a week later. Same elevator, similar time of night. This time it stopped between floors again. Same hard jolt, same flickering light. But instead of knocking, I heard something dragging across the roof of the elevator car. Slow, heavy, like a weight being pulled a few feet and then pausing, then pulled again. My hand went straight to my radio. I called it in, told dispatch I was stuck in the service elevator, and something sounded like it was on top of the car, which even as I said it out loud sounded absurd, but nobody laughed at me over the radio, which somehow made it worse. Facilities came and manually released the car, and when they inspected the shaft afterward, they found nothing, no debris, no equipment failure, nothing that would explain the dragging sound. I brought it up with a couple of the day shift guards during a shift changeover, mostly to see if I was the only one experiencing this. One of them, an older guy named Reyes, who's worked there almost 15 years, got quiet in a way that told me I wasn't imagining things being off. He said the sub-basement has always had a reputation among the older staff that there'd been an incident decades back involving a maintenance worker who'd gotten caught in the shaft during a malfunction and been seriously injured, though he wasn't sure of the full story or whether the guy survived. He said newer staff mostly don't know about it because it happened long before the current building management took over, but that some of the old-timers still avoid taking that elevator alone at night if they can help it. That should have been enough to make me more careful, and for a while it was. I started doing my sub-basement checks with a co-worker whenever possible, or taking the stairwell instead of the elevator, even though it added time to my rounds. But staffing gets thin some nights, and about 3 weeks ago I ended up doing a solo overnight shift with no one available to cover the basement checks with me. I put it off as long as I could, but around 2 a.m. I couldn't avoid it any longer. I took the stairs down instead of the elevator, thinking that would sidestep the problem entirely. The sub-basement corridor was lit when I got there, which was a relief, and I did my walkthrough without incident until I reached the morgue's outer door, which is supposed to stay locked at all times outside of authorized access. It was open about 6 inches. I stood there for a long moment before pushing it the rest of the way open with my flashlight raised. The room inside was cold in the ordinary refrigerated way it's supposed to be. Storage units along the far wall, a prep table in the center, everything exactly where it should be. Nothing was out of place. I checked the access log on the door panel, which records every badge entry electronically, and there had been no entries logged in over 6 hours, meaning no one with authorization had opened that door, and yet it had been standing open. I secured it, confirmed the lock engaged properly, and finished the rest of my rounds faster than usual, badly wanting to be back on the main floor under normal lighting with other people around. On my way back to the stairwell, I passed the service elevator, doors closed, car presumably sitting wherever it had last been used. As I walked past, I heard from inside the closed elevator shaft that same slow dragging sound I'd heard on top of the car weeks earlier, except now it was moving, tracking along with my footsteps at exactly my pace, staying level with me as I walked the length of the corridor toward the stairwell door. I didn't run, mostly out of some professional instinct not to, but I walked faster than I've ever walked in that building, and I didn't look back until I had the stairwell door shut behind me. I sat on the stairs for a few minutes, catching my breath before finishing my shift. I filed an incident report that night. Factual, no speculation. Just documenting the unlocked morgue door and the access log discrepancy, because that at least was something concrete I could point to. A couple weeks after the morgue door incident, I finally worked up the nerve to look through the hospital's old incident archive, which the facilities office keeps mostly as a formality. Boxes of paper records going back to before the building had digital systems at all. Reyes helped me get access, vouching for me with the records clerk, so I didn't have to explain exactly why I wanted to go digging. It took a couple of hours of sorting through irrelevant maintenance logs before I found what he'd been vaguely referencing. A report from the late 80s describing a maintenance technician who'd been performing repairs on the service elevator's counterweight system when a cable failed, pinning him partially inside the shaft for almost 2 hours before he could be freed. The report noted he survived, but never returned to work at the hospital afterward. There was no follow-up documentation on what happened to him after that. I told Reyes what I'd found, and he nodded slowly, like it confirmed something he'd already half known. He mentioned that a few of the old-timers used to say the elevator ran differently at night than during the day, faster sometimes, or reluctant to move at all, depending on who was riding it, though he'd always assumed that was just the kind of story that gets exaggerated over decades of night shifts and boredom. Neither of us had a theory that made it feel less real. A few nights after that conversation, doing a badge check on the main floor, the service elevator arrived on its own, without anyone calling it. Doors sliding open onto an empty car, the overhead light inside flickering in a slow, uneven rhythm that didn't match any electrical fault the maintenance team could later identify. Facilities investigated the access log issue and couldn't explain it, chalked it up to a software glitch in the badge system, though they couldn't reproduce the failure in testing. The door hasn't opened unexplained since, as far as I know, but the elevator hasn't gotten any better. I still hear the knocking most weeks, still catch the dragging sound at least once or twice a month, always on nights when I'm working alone down there. I've requested a transfer to a different building in the hospital network, which is pending, but until it comes through I'm still doing sub-basement rounds on my regular schedule. And every single time that elevator jolts to a stop between floors, I stand very still and wait, and I try not to think too hard about what might be on the other side of that thin metal roof above my head. The phone in the barn. My grandmother left me the farmhouse when she passed, along with about 40 acres that my family hasn't actively worked in over a decade. I'm not a farmer. I work remotely doing IT support, and my plan was always to fix the place up over a year or two and either sell it or rent it out. I drove up in early spring with a truck full of tools and cleaning supplies, expecting a straightforward if exhausting few months of work. The house itself was in reasonable shape. My grandmother had kept it up well into her last years. But the barn was another story. Decades of accumulated junk and disrepair that nobody in the family had wanted to deal with. The rotary phone was in the barn office, a small room off the main space that my grandfather had used as a workspace back when the farm was still fully operational, before he passed. The phone itself is an old black rotary model, the kind with a heavy handset and a dial you spin with your finger, mounted on the wall next to a corkboard, still pinned with decades-old receipts and a faded calendar from a year I wasn't alive for. I knew immediately it couldn't be connected to anything. The farm hasn't had active phone service in years. My grandmother used a cell phone exclusively for the last decade of her life. And when I traced the wire from the back of the phone, it ran along the baseboard for about 6 feet and then just ended, cut clean. No connection to any junction box or outside line. I didn't think about the phone again for the better part of a week, focused on clearing out the main barn space, hauling scrap metal, sorting through tools that were worth keeping from ones that had rusted beyond use. Then, on a night about 8 days into the work, I was in the farmhouse asleep when I woke up to a sound I couldn't immediately place. A shrill mechanical ringing, old-fashioned in its tone, coming from somewhere outside the house. It took me a full groggy minute to place it as a phone ringing, and another minute after that to remember there was no working phone line anywhere on the property, except my own cell phone, which was sitting silent on my nightstand. I told myself it was some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by exhaustion, since I'd been working physically hard all week and hadn't been sleeping great. It didn't happen again that night, and by morning I'd mostly convinced myself I'd dreamed it. I went out to the barn to keep working, and out of curiosity more than anything, I walked into the office and looked at the phone. It was sitting exactly where I'd left it, receiver on the hook, nothing disturbed. I picked it up out of idle curiosity and held it to my ear. Dead silence, as expected from a disconnected line. I set it back down and went back to work. 4 nights later, it rang again, except this time I was awake, sitting in the farmhouse kitchen around midnight, going through old paperwork I'd found in a filing cabinet. The ringing was unmistakable this time, coming clearly from the direction of the barn, that same shrill old-fashioned tone repeating in a steady rhythm. I sat very still at the kitchen table for a long moment, telling myself it was some kind of electrical phenomenon, maybe a different line somewhere on the property I didn't know about, feedback from a neighbor's system, carrying strangely across open farmland at night. None of that made sense, but I needed something to hold on to. Eventually the ringing stopped on its own, cutting off mid-ring rather than fading out. I called my brother the next day, who'd grown up on visits to that farm, same as I had, and asked if he remembered anything about the phone, any story attached to it. He said he vaguely remembered our grandfather using it back when we were kids. Nothing unusual, just an ordinary farm office phone. He didn't have any explanation for why it would be ringing now, and when I told him about the cut wire with no connection to anything, he suggested maybe I was dealing with some kind of animal in the barn walls, mice or a bird's nest interfering with old wiring in a way that produced sound. I wanted that explanation to be true. It didn't hold up against what happened next. About 2 weeks in, I decided to deal with the phone directly, rather than keep dreading it. I unscrewed it from the wall mount, coiled the dead wire around the base, and carried the whole thing out to the burn pile at the edge of the property, where I'd been disposing of unsalvageable junk. I set it down among the debris and went back to work in the barn, feeling a strange, disproportionate sense of relief for having gotten rid of an object that had never done anything more than make a noise a few times. That relief lasted exactly 1 day. The following night it rang again, from the direction of the barn, same as always, even though the phone itself was sitting 100 yards away on the burn pile. I lay in bed listening to it, my chest tight, unable to make myself get up and check. It rang for what felt like a very long time, far longer than any of the previous times before finally stopping. In the morning, I walked out to the barn office first, dreading what I'd find, and the phone was back on the wall mount, screwed in exactly as it had been before, wire running along the baseboard to the same severed end. I walked out to the burn pile to check if maybe I was wrong, if maybe there was a second phone I was forgetting about, but there was nothing there matching what I'd disposed of, no trace of it among the other debris. I didn't tell my brother about that part. I wasn't sure he'd believe me, and honestly, some part of me didn't want to say it out loud and make it feel more real than it already did. Instead, I started documenting things, taking photos of the phone's position each day, time-stamping them, trying to build some kind of record, even though I wasn't sure what I'd do with it. The ringing continued irregular, sometimes going 4 or 5 nights without happening at all, then ringing 2 nights in a row. I noticed a pattern eventually, that it tended to happen more often on nights when I'd spent the day working specifically inside the barn rather than the farmhouse, as though my presence in that space triggered something. About 3 weeks ago, I worked up the nerve to answer it during one of the nighttime calls instead of just listening from the house. I walked out to the barn with a flashlight, my hand actually shaking on the handle of the office door, and picked up the receiver mid-ring. There was no dial tone, no static, nothing that sounded like an open line, but there was something, a faint, uneven breathing, distant, like it was coming from underwater or through several closed doors. I said hello, my voice barely above a whisper. The breathing paused for a moment, like it had heard me, and then the line went dead. And the ringing didn't happen again for 11 days after that, the longest gap since it started. During that 11-day gap, I went through more of my grandfather's old paperwork in the filing cabinet, hoping to find something that would explain the phone, an old bill, a service record, anything with a name attached to it. What I found instead was a small notebook tucked behind the hanging folders, filled with his handwriting, mostly farm accounts and weather notes, but with a handful of entries scattered across different years that all mentioned the phone specifically. One entry, dated maybe 15 years before he passed, said only that the line rang again last night and that he didn't answer it, followed by a second line that just read, "Some things you let ring out." There was no further explanation anywhere in the notebook, no names, no incident described, just that same phrase repeated in slightly different words across 3 or 4 other entries over the years. I called my aunt, my grandfather's youngest daughter, and asked if she remembered anything about the phone or knew what he might have meant by that notebook entry. She went quiet on the line for a moment and then told me reluctantly that there had been a hired hand who worked the farm generations back, before even my grandfather's time, who died in some kind of accident on the property. Though she didn't know the details and said it was the sort of thing the older relatives used to mention only in passing and never wanted to discuss directly. She said her father had always been strange about that barn office, wouldn't let any of the kids play in there growing up. And now, knowing what I know, I understand that reluctance a little better than I did before. I asked my aunt if she knew what had happened to the hired hand's belongings, whether anything of his had ever ended up stored in that barn office alongside my grandfather's things, thinking maybe there was some object I hadn't identified yet, that mattered more than the phone itself. She said she didn't know, that it had all happened so far back it was basically family legend rather than anything documented, and that my grandfather had never been willing to elaborate no matter how many times she or her siblings had asked him about that office growing up. She did tell me one more thing before we hung up, almost in passing, that our grandfather used to say the phone wasn't the problem, answering it was, and that as long as nobody picked it up, it would eventually stop on its own. I've thought about that a great deal since, mostly because I already broke that rule once. It's ringing again now, on and off, same as before. I've stopped trying to get rid of the phone since I know it doesn't stay gone. I've stopped trying to explain it to my family since none of them believe me, and I don't blame them. I still don't know who was breathing on the other end of that line, or why a phone with no connection anywhere on Earth keeps ringing in a barn on the edge of a farm. Nobody actively works anymore. I'm still living in the farmhouse, still fixing the place up during the day, and every night I lie in bed and listen for that first shrill ring to start somewhere out past the dark fields. And some nights it comes and some nights it doesn't. And I've never once worked up the courage to go out there and answer it a second time. The monitor in the nursery. My wife and I bought our house about 8 months ago, a 3-bedroom place built in the 70s that needed some updating, but was structurally solid, which was the main thing we cared about, since we were expecting our first baby and didn't have time or money for a project house. We spent the last 2 months before the due date converting the smallest bedroom into a nursery, painting, assembling furniture, all the ordinary things new parents do. Our daughter was born in early autumn, and by the time we brought her home, the nursery was finished, calm, painted a soft grey with a mobile over the crib that one of my wife's co-workers had given us as a gift. We set up a baby monitor with both audio and video, a fairly standard model that streams to an app on our phones, camera mounted on a shelf angled down at the crib. For the first month, it worked exactly as expected, picking up her crying, her breathing, the small sounds babies make. I'm an accountant, not someone with much imagination, and my wife works in logistics, equally practical, so when I say what happened next, unsettled both of us, I want that to mean something, because neither of us is inclined toward jumping to strange conclusions. It started about 5 weeks after we brought her home. I was on monitor duty for the night, half asleep in bed with the app open on the nightstand, glancing at it whenever I heard a sound. Around 2 in the morning, the audio picked up something that wasn't her crying, a low, tuneless humming, adult in register, coming from somewhere in the room. I sat straight up, grabbed the phone and stared at the video feed. The nursery looked exactly as it should. Dim nightlight glow, our daughter asleep in the crib, nothing visibly out of place. The humming continued for maybe 15 seconds and then stopped. I told myself it was audio interference, some kind of signal bleed from a neighbor's baby monitor, picking up on the same frequency, which does happen with cheaper models, though ours wasn't supposed to be susceptible to that. I mentioned it to my wife in the morning, trying to keep my tone light. She said she'd heard something similar a few nights earlier, during her own shift, but hadn't brought it up because she'd assumed the same thing, interference, or maybe audio from the television downstairs carrying up through the vents in some strange acoustic quirk of the house. We checked the monitor's settings, made sure it wasn't picking up a neighboring channel, and everything looked correctly configured. For about a week after that, nothing else happened, and we let ourselves believe it really had just been a glitch. Then, on a night I was up late, working from my laptop in the living room, the monitor app on my phone buzzed with a motion alert, which it's programmed to do whenever it detects movement in the frame outside of normal sleep stirring. I opened the app immediately, heart already picking up before I'd even seen anything, and watched the video feed in real time. My daughter was asleep in the crib, unmoving. But near the doorway of the nursery, at the very edge of the camera's frame, there was a shape low to the ground that hadn't been there a moment before. It didn't look like a person standing, more like something crouched or kneeling, indistinct in the low light. As I watched, it didn't move, didn't shift position, just sat there at the edge of the frame for several seconds before the image glitched, a brief, pixelated stutter, and when it cleared, the shape was gone. I was up the stairs and into the nursery within seconds, adrenaline overriding any attempt at calm. The room was empty except for our daughter, still sleeping soundly, undisturbed. The door had been open the way we always leave it. I checked the closet. Behind the changing table, everywhere a person could conceivably be hiding, and found nothing. I stood there for a long time afterward, just watching her breathe, feeling a specific kind of fear that's different from being scared for yourself. A fear that has nowhere to go because there's nothing to fight and everything to protect. We reviewed the recorded footage the next morning. Since the app saves motion-triggered clips automatically, the clip existed, time-stamped correctly, and it showed exactly what I'd seen live: the shape at the doorway, the glitch, the shape gone. My wife watched it 3 times in a row without saying anything, and then closed the laptop and asked me, in a voice that was working very hard to stay steady, whether we should consider moving the crib into our room for a while. We did that night, and for the next several nights the monitor stayed quiet. No humming, no motion alerts, and we started to relax into thinking that maybe proximity had solved whatever the problem was. About 2 weeks later, feeling more confident, we moved her back into the nursery. The first night back, everything was calm. The second night, around 3 in the morning, the monitor's audio picked up the humming again, closer this time. Close enough that I could make out something almost like a broken melody underneath the tunelessness. 3 or 4 notes repeated in a loop that never quite resolved. I went in immediately, and the room was empty and quiet the moment I opened the door, the way it always seemed to be the instant a person actually looked. My daughter was awake this time, not crying, just lying there with her eyes open, looking toward the corner of the room near the closet, tracking something with her eyes the way infants do when they're following movement. Except there was nothing in that corner that I could see. I did some research into the house's history after that, county records mostly. Previous owners going back as far as public documents allowed. The house had changed hands 4 times since it was built. Nothing suspicious in any of the transfers as far as I could tell. No reported deaths on the property. Nothing in local news archives tied to the address. I talked to the neighbor 2 doors down, an older woman who's lived on the street for over 30 years and would have overlapped with at least 2 of the previous owners. She remembered a family with a young child who'd lived there in the early 90s and mentioned, almost as an aside, that the family had moved out somewhat abruptly, after only about 1.5 years, though she didn't know why, and didn't seem inclined to speculate further when I gently pressed. We bought a second monitor, a completely different brand, and set it up alongside the first, angled from a different position in the room, hoping that if one was somehow malfunctioning, having a second independent device would help us tell real from artifact. Both monitors picked up the humming on the same night about a week later. Audio synced within a second of each other, which ruled out a hardware-specific glitch as an explanation. Neither monitor caught a visual that time, just the sound, but hearing it duplicated across 2 separate systems made it much harder to keep telling ourselves it wasn't real. My wife suggested we talk to someone, not a religious figure exactly, since neither of us is particularly observant, but her mother knew a woman locally who did a kind of informal house blessing for people, and out of a mix of desperation and not having a better option, we had her come by. She walked through the nursery slowly, didn't say much, and at one point stopped near the closet, the same corner our daughter had been staring at, and said only that the room held on to something that didn't want to leave, though she couldn't tell us what or why. She did a brief ritual that involved salt along the windowsill and door frame, and left without charging us more than a token amount, which somehow made the whole experience feel more serious rather than less. For about 2 weeks after that, the monitor stayed completely silent at night, no humming, no motion alerts, and we let ourselves hope cautiously that whatever it had been was gone. Then 10 days ago the humming came back, along with something new, a faint shifting sound like fabric, or a blanket being adjusted, though our daughter's blanket in the video feed never actually moved. I've started sleeping in the nursery myself some nights, in a chair pulled up next to the crib, telling myself it's just extra vigilance for a new parent, though we both know it's more than that. My wife does the same on the nights I'm not there. Neither of us has said out loud that we're taking turns guarding the room, but that's exactly what we're doing. We haven't moved out, and honestly I don't know if we will, because everything else about this house is what we wanted. Close to both our jobs, good schools nearby, a yard for her to grow up in eventually. For now, we keep the monitor running. Keep the salt line along the windowsill topped up, even though neither of us fully believes in what it's supposed to do. And every night around 2 or 3 in the morning, one of us lies awake listening for that first note of humming to start, hoping it doesn't and knowing that most weeks it will. The piano in room 114. I've worked as the night custodian at a middle school for almost 6 years now, cleaning classrooms after the last bus leaves, locking up the gym, doing a final walkthrough before setting the alarm around 10. Most of my shift is unremarkable, the kind of quiet, repetitive work that lets your mind wander. The building itself is older, built in the 60s, with a couple of additions since: wide hallways, tall windows, the particular smell every school has of floor wax and old paper. Room 114 is the music room, tucked at the end of the east wing, and it's the only part of the building I've ever genuinely disliked being in alone. The room has an upright piano along the back wall, decades old, badly out of tune in a couple of registers, that the music teacher keeps meaning to have serviced and never quite gets around to. My job in there most nights is just to empty the trash, wipe down the stands and vacuum, nothing that should take more than 10 minutes. The first time something happened, I was almost done vacuuming when I heard faintly a single piano note from behind me, low, somewhere in the bass register. I turned around assuming a student had wandered back in after hours, which happens occasionally with kids waiting on a late pickup, but the room was empty. The piano lid closed exactly as I'd found it. I told myself the note had come from somewhere else in the building, sound carrying strangely through the old ductwork the way it sometimes does, and finished up without thinking too much more about it. It happened again about a week later, this time 3 notes instead of 1, played close enough together that they could have been a deliberate sequence rather than a random sound. And again the piano lid was closed when I checked, the bench pushed neatly under it, nothing disturbed. I mentioned it to one of the day custodians during a shift overlap, expecting him to laugh it off, but he got a strange look and told me he'd heard something similar a few times over the years, always at night, never during the day, and that he'd stopped going into that room alone after dark unless he absolutely had to. For a while after that, I started rushing through my routine in room 114, doing the bare minimum, and getting out as fast as I could, which isn't really an option long term, since the job requires a proper clean each night. About 3 weeks after the 3-note incident, I was wiping down the stands when the piano started again, except this time it wasn't isolated notes. It was something closer to an actual halting melody. Simple, like a beginner working through a lesson, except slower and more uneven than any student I've heard practice in that room during the day. I stood absolutely still, cloth in hand, and watched the closed piano lid the entire time it played, maybe 20 seconds, before it stopped abruptly mid-phrase. I walked over afterward, hands not quite steady, and lifted the lid myself. The keys were exactly where they should be, nothing pressed down, no dust disturbed on the surface in a way that would suggest fingers had recently been on them. I checked underneath the piano, behind it, inside the bench where the sheet music is stored. Nothing. I closed the lid and finished the room as fast as I reasonably could, and reported it to the school's facilities office the next morning, more to have it on record than because I expected them to do anything useful with the information. They sent someone to inspect the piano the following week, a technician who checked the internal mechanism for anything that could produce sound without a key being pressed, some kind of mechanical fault or loose part vibrating against the strings. He didn't find anything. He did mention, almost as an aside while packing up his tools, that the school district's older buildings sometimes had this kind of reputation among staff. Pianos or organs that seemed to play themselves, and that he'd heard similar stories at 2 other schools over the years, though he always assumed it was pipes or settling structures rather than anything stranger. I wanted to believe that. Standing in that room at night, it's much harder to believe. I asked one of the long-time teachers, a woman who's taught at the school for almost 30 years, and remembers renovations and staff changes most people have forgotten, whether she knew anything about the music room specifically. She told me, somewhat reluctantly, that a student had died in a car accident decades ago, a kid who'd been in band, and that the room had briefly been used for a small memorial display before the school moved on the way schools do. She didn't know if it was the same room, The building had been reconfigured since then and room numbers had changed at least once, but she said the timing roughly lined up with when staff first started mentioning odd things happening in there at night. Since then, the melody has kept coming back, roughly once every couple of weeks, always at night, always while I'm alone in that wing of the building. It's gotten slightly more complex each time, like whoever or whatever is playing is practicing, improving in small increments the way a student actually would over the course of a school year. Last week it played for almost a full minute, longer than ever before, and for the first time I thought I heard, underneath the notes, something that might have been humming along with the melody, faint and childlike, though I can't be fully certain that wasn't my own mind, filling in a detail that wasn't really there. I brought a small digital recorder in one night, the kind investigators use, cheap but supposedly sensitive enough to pick up things below normal hearing range, and left it running on top of the piano while I cleaned the rest of the room with my back to it. Nothing played that particular night, no notes at all, which almost felt worse after all the build-up of finally trying to catch it properly. When I reviewed the recording the next morning anyway, near the very end of the file, after I'd already switched off the vacuum and was zipping up my supply bag, there's a faint 2-second stretch of what sounds like slow, careful breathing, close to the microphone, followed by the recorder shutting off on its own 11 minutes before its battery should have died. I've asked to be reassigned to a different wing of the building for my nightly rounds, and my supervisor said she'd look into shifting the schedule, though nothing has changed yet. Until it does, I still do my walkthrough of room 114 every night around the same time, and I've started leaving the piano lid open on purpose instead of closed. A small experiment I haven't fully explained even to myself, just to see if it changes anything. So far it hasn't. The notes still come from inside the closed mechanism, regardless of whether the lid is up or down, and every time I hear that first low note start behind me, while my back is turned, I have to force myself to finish the room instead of walking straight out, because the job still needs doing, and because some stubborn part of me still wants proof of what's actually causing it, even though every time I turn around, there's never anything there to see.